I'm not going to go into this in great depth, but I've started this process with a fairly obvious, or I like to think it's obvious, intuition. None of us is ever fully represented. Representation of our interests or identities in politics is always incomplete and always partial. So what this implies is that representation is about a claim and not a fact. We might elect a politician, we might elect a party, but the mere fact of their election does not mean they can or will speak for the range of interests and identities that make us up. What people make of that claim is another story, which I'll come on to in a moment. This is an especially riveting slide, I find. Yeah. So what's in this claim, this idea of this representative claim? So normally the idea of representation has it that someone stands for, speaks for, or acts for another. In other words, a subject stands for an object, an elected MP for a constituency, for example. But I think we need to look more widely than that. Somebody makes the claim, there is a maker, and the thing represented, the object, is an idea or image of the thing rather than the thing itself, which is better called a referent. So, if a politician makes him or herself the subject who stands for an object, the object is his or her idea or their preferred image of the constituency, good, hard-working family folk, for example, rather than the referent, which is all the other things the constituency is or might be in reality. And all of this process needs and has an audience which receives the claims and accepts them, rejects them, or ignores them. So there are different ingredients to the representative claim. And the rumour that I wake up in the middle of the night going, Sora, is just not true. And so if you look through the lens of these kind of terms, there are different types of representative claim. You know, the MP as a maker offers him or herself as a subject, as the embodiment of the constituency's interests, the hard-working folk, the object, to that constituency, the audience. And the referent, the real people being represented, if you like, is like a silent background condition in this process. Or, one other quick example, anti-globalization demonstrators as makers set themselves up and their movements, the subjects, as representative of the oppressed and downtrodden, the object, to Western governments as an audience. Now, I find this kind of thing a useful key to think through a lot of issues around representation. We can do lots of things with this approach. So the one I focus on here briefly is whether unelected figures who claim to be representatives sometimes can actually be representatives. But to think clearly about that, I think we need to think just for a moment about elected actors. How representative can they be, elected actors? There are real limits, and most of the time I think they know it. So let's look at the limits, especially in terms of identities. Elected politicians, and I'm being pretty stark in the way I put these points, elected politicians pick out particular selective aspects of us, the constituents, and often ignore others that don't suit their picture or image of us. Particular claims always crowd out other possible bases of claims, crowd out the other things that we might be. I think elected politicians also tend to represent a snapshot of us at one time, more or less frozen. So if we're changing constantly, they will always, in a sense, be misrepresenting us. And related to that, elected politicians have, in a way, a captive audience, a bit like you. There will always be elections. There will always be voters, there will always be audiences for elections in established democracies. They have a captive audience. And in certain ways, therefore, oddly, they don't have to try too hard with their representative claims to be convincing. The machinery in which they are taking part does quite a bit of that work for them. So in these and other senses, elected politicians choose selective portrayals of us as much as we choose them by voting for them. Like a portrait painter, a politician picks from among the many things that we are or might be, those things that suit their pictures of us. But as the writer Marcel Proust put it, we are not a materially constituted whole, identical for everyone. which each of us can examine like a list of specifications or a testament. Our social personality is a creation of other people's thought. Now, the limits to elective representation can be found in structural factors too, that is, reasons to do with the nature of the state and government in general, the broader political rules of the game, if you like. And I'll put these points fairly starkly as well. Now, we choose politicians by voting, for sure, but they are part of the state, which is permanent, and which we don't choose. So there's choice involved, but we are also fated to have them. I think that fact is behind the old complaint that whoever I vote for, a politician gets elected. And that the choice between political parties often feels like one between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, as an old Australian textbook of mine put it. And second, there is what we might call the oneness or the singularity of the state. So normally, representation is seen as being one to all, one state to all of us citizens in the country, one to all. So the symbolic architecture of our political systems reflects and reinforces that kind of metaphor. The symbolism is that of the pyramid, with state or government at the peak. So this symbolism runs through the famous 17th century image in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, with all the people contained within the image, all the people contained within the ruler's body. How well you can see that, I'm not sure. Take my word for it. As well as in the encompassing domes of parliaments and legislatures, symbolizing the oneness of the nation. And here we have the example of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. But this oneness, this symbol, this singularity, is more symbol than reality. And the gap between the symbol and the reality is where you can find the question of how representative of all our interests our elected leaders can really be. Further, the state symbolically represents the nation. Elected governments represent the people. There are subtly different levels of representation going on in there. The government-people representation is nested within state-nation representation. When they're not accurately representing people's views, government leaders always have the option of, in a sense, going up a level and claiming to speak as the state on the larger nation's interests, or for the larger nation's interests. With one level of representation nested inside another, the two are easily, and sometimes deliberately, confused. Charles de Gaulle expressed, I think, the point graphically that I'm trying to make with his comment that in politics it's necessary either to betray one's country or the electorate. I prefer to betray the electorate. Fourth, and less abstractly, parties choose candidates. We're further limited in our choices. Many of the candidate choices are made before we get to vote. And on top of that, elected politicians often don't have to make their claims to be representative particularly explicit. The system does it for them, referring back to the pyramidal one-to-all symbolism. So even on more straightforward grounds, we can question, I think, the strength of representative claims arising from the fact of election. They include the effects of first-past-the-post electoral systems, like that of the UK, where huge parliamentary majorities emerge from a minority of votes. The fact that rates of non-voting in non-compulsory systems are so high, and in many cases growing still, and the ambiguous status of non-enfranchised interests, such as those as children and young people. So in short, the state has a unique capacity to represent us, no doubt, but it also has a unique capacity to misrepresent us. The state and its agents also have a near-unique incentive to emphasize the former bit and to play down the latter. State representatives, our politicians, must make forgeries. They must be forgeries. They must conduct imposture. They must be imposters. They must misrepresent in order to represent. Now, this is not to say, of course, that all politicians are lying cynics. There is always evidence for the type of cynicism de Gaulle again expressed when he said that since a politician never believes what he says, he's always astonished when others do.